I have the pleasure to introduce Ole B. Jensen to you. You probably have, all of us have met during various dinners and lunches. It's still very helpful, I think, to have like some background where people come from, as this is also a very interdisciplinary setting. So Ole Jensen is professor of urban theory and urban design at the Development of Architecture, Design and Media Theory at Aalborg University in Denmark. He's a sociologist by training, and his research interests are urban design, public space design, urban mobilities and technologies, and social inclusion and exclusion in cities. He is vice head of the Department for Research and the co-founder and vice director of the Center for Mobilities and Urban Studies, also at Aalborg University. He's the author of, I just looked a little bit through the publications and I didn't know which ones to mention of the around 290 or something. But just maybe to mention some. Staging Mobilities is, with Routledge in 2013, Designing Mobilities Design, Urban Designs for Mobile Situations in 2017, and Mobility in Justice by Design. He's co-editor of the Handbook of Urban Mobilities and the 4-volume collection Mobilities in the series Critical Concepts of in-Built Environment. The title of today's talk is Drone Visuals and Beyond, Exploring the Potentials of Volumetric, Visual, and More Than Visual Aerial Sensing. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind invitation, and thank you to the organizers for inviting. As said, my background is in sociology, and the work I present today is not exactly brand new. Some of it leans on earlier work, and in my current interest, I work very much with social exclusion in public spaces. I have a forthcoming book titled Mobility and Justice by Design, but I'm also interested in technologies, and particularly I've been working around drones, not because I am specifically interested in drones, but because drones enables a particular conversation within urban design and planning, which is about understanding volume, right? So in planning, most of you know the literature criticizing flat projections and ideas about, the planar. And so, in a sense, I realized that drones enables not just me to think about volumes, but also to communicate with students in urban design about space in a volumetric sort of sense. So that's very much where the interest actually comes from. And then, obviously, as you start diving in, and we've seen over the last day and a half here, issues of power and exclusion connects very well to these types of technologies. Right, let me see if I can figure this out. So this is the plan. I want to say a few things for introduction, and then I want to spend sort of roughly my time in 3 sections. One is framing. Oops, this is running. Framing. And then a little trick that some of you might know, when you don't really have good empirical, solid, deep stuff, you can talk about vignettes. So it's a sort of trick to sort of scoot over a little bit. But I am actually scooting over a little bit here, and I would be happy to have deeper conversations about it. But I thought for the presentation that it would be nice to show more than just one sort of angle to this. So I want to talk a little bit about some empirical needle pins, as it were, where you can start thinking about some of these points that I'm trying to frame. And then hopefully I'll surface at the end with some concluding reflections and themes for further research. The presence of aerial vision mediated by drone technology has led to multiple changes and transformations. In the war in Ukraine, drone technologies interfere on the battleground daily. In fields of practice, such as policing and surveillance, the presence of drones has become household items. Also, surveying and planning is being transformed by the presence of drones. In this presentation explores the insight and lessons within urban design and urban surveillance, and I'll move beyond the visual to include wider understanding of what drone sensing might mean. The structure will be theoretical framing, followed by the 3 empirical vignettes and some final remarks, as it were. So let me start by thinking a little bit about framing. Most of what we've seen, and when we talk about empirical cases, needs to be conceptualized. So you can think about framing as the vocabulary or the language that enables us to make sense of things. And of course, here are multiple opportunities and options. So in today's talk, I've picked out two themes that I think is particularly of my interest, and one is related to machinic sensation, and the other one is what I call situational elasticity, or the stretched situation. And that might sound weird, but let's see how that pans out when we get to it. Sensing like a machine, what I'm particularly interested in here is to try to include some more multimodality perspectives rather than the visual, which there's plenty of examples of visuality in drone research, and of course it's super relevant. But in relationship to the critique of planar representations of space, I think also there's understanding of how multiple modalities of drone sensation can enable a wider understanding of spaces and geographies are actually quite important. So you could argue that we need to move from seeing to sensing, because the remote sensing technologies relies on more than simply cameras. Thermal sensors, air quality sensors, and many other types of sensing devices suggest that our vocabulary for describing the extended and remote sensing drones afford, that the extended and remote sensing that drones afford should be more granular. Also, we just heard about chemistry, different types of thermal sensoring, different types of technologies that allows us to understand space in a more sort of granular way. And next to this idea of understanding the multiplicity and multimodality of sensing, I think there is something really interesting happening around the ways in which software and algorithmic transformation is happening. So I think different sensor technologies enacting different sensorial modalities should be related to an increased complexity in algorithmic analysis and programming. Here, AI-based configurations with language learning and more or less autonomous feedback models suggest that drone sensing not only registers different sensorial modalities, but also works analytically at a new and more complex level. So complex pattern recognition and fast data analysis, moving way beyond human cognitive capacity, adds a layer of complexity to what we might call drone sensing. One of the ways in which you can make tie up some of that argument together is by looking at it as what Don Eide has termed an epistemology engine. Now, this is a quote from my 2020 paper, Thinking with the Drone, and where I argue that the American techno-philosopher and post-phenomenologist Don Eide speaks of epistemology, of an epistemology engine, as a way of illustrating how particular technologies and artifacts may be tied to particular ways of knowing the world. Galileo's telescope is one such case in Eide's analysis. The various ways in which inventions such as telescopes, microscopes, and other reading devices have been connected to what could be known leads Eide to speak of these technologies as epistemology engines. If the drone is an epistemology engine, this will not only mean that it renders new ways of seeing the world naturalized after some time, it also carries the repercussions for the epistemologies of knowing the world and ultimately to the ontologies related here too. So I wanted to spend even more time diving into the framing, but I want to move on to the vignettes and the empirical stories. But I think recapping and summing up a little bit around the framing, I'm really interested in seeing how the multimodality of drone sensing connects to the way we know about spaces and know the materiality of the world, as it were. So that's kind of like the one leg of the framing, as it were. The other one is tied into some work I've been doing over many years. For 25 plus years, I've been studying public spaces and human interaction. I'm interested in how bodies and technologies and spaces are put together by designers, by people themselves, by accident, by all kinds of mediation. And so to get some kind of handle on that, I was trying to think through the concept of which is, it's not a very sexy concept. I call it the connectivity proximity nexus, which sounds really bad, but it's been around for a while, so I'm probably stuck with it. But in a paper I wrote, published in 2021 on COVID and social distances, I was thinking a little bit harder about these ideas and thinking about the elasticity of the situation. And I argued that the concept elastic situation is based on the already articulated idea of connectivity, proximity, nexus. The idea is that the situation stretches out, as it were, via technology, infrastructure, and other artifacts. Face-to-face interaction is relying on body language and gestures, visual and audio communication of spoken languages. The distance we meaningful can speak of as a situation has changed dramatically with the advent of digital communication technology. I want to just draw back to a nice diagram made by Panella back in 2007, arguing that in pre-sort of digital mediation history, the way to connect or interact would be by proximity. So you wanted to trade, you had to go to the market. You wanted to communicate, you had to shout or at least communicate in a sort of, so proximity was a critical factor. Number of mediations, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that in this context where I know people know much more about that, but from the press, print press and onwards with digital technologies, connectivity is no longer a condition, or proximity is no longer a prime condition for connectivity. So you can actually connect across spaces. Hi, it's me, I'm on the bus, all these sorts of things, which kind of suggests to me, as a student of the social situation, that I need to think about the reconfiguration of how proximity and connectivity connects. And this actually connects a little bit and has something to do with drone technologies, because drones are one out of many technologies that reconfigures this proximity connectivity nexus, which I understand as a dialectic and dynamic relationship between physical process and co-presence and mediated connections across time and space. And of course, when you're studying mobile situations, as I've been doing, this is kind of critical. And I think also in light of the conversation of understanding drone sensing, this enables a different, not necessarily better, but at least a different understanding of scale and scalar politics, how this elasticity of mediation between connection and proximity is actually played out. In the case of drones, I think through the reconfiguration of the connectivity proximity nexus, we see a stretching of the situation. We've seen many examples of that. Of course, the drone piloting, the kill at a distance, all that stuff. I'll return to some of this thinking when I talk a little bit about the case of surveillance. So I think these are important dimensions to consider. So they in the theory, or in the sort of the framing of that question, of the question of drones. And the final thing that I just wanted to flag then is that comes together in this understanding of volumetric mobility, and this is an argument I made in the 2020 paper on thinking with a drone, that the flat projections and their accompanying ontologies are challenged by the fact that drones enable seamless movement in 3 dimensions. As any drone operator can tell, the difference between remotely directing an artifact in 2 dimensions, like a remote controlled car, and in 3 dimensions, like a drone or helicopter, is decisive and challenging. Moving horizontally, vertically, and diagonally is precisely what enables a perception of volume. Volumetric thinking means an awareness of an X, a Y, and Z axis that spans out the 3-dimensional space, or spoken more plainly, the fact that the drone moves up, down, sideways, and to the front and back is all about volumetric space in which it can move. And as you start unfolding that in interactions, for instance, with students, it becomes really a helpful didactic device as much as a sort of an ontological feature of the technology in the world. So let me just very quickly try to recap. I want to think about drones and more than the visual sensing in light of these framings. So the multimodality of sensing technologies that you can actually apply to drones, but also the fact that they are redescribing or reenacting the situation, which becomes extremely dynamic and very elastic, which I think is one of the key elements to look at. So if you think about that framing as a sort of set of classes they put on, how would that enable us to talk about different empirical examples or vignettes, as I call them? So let me try to move to that. So vignette 1 I call just right. And it's a report from an urban design studio activity that we've been doing lately in our program with the urban design students. And it's related to an urban design curriculum activity where urban design students are utilizing drones to make their design mapping and proposals. Now, interestingly, however, not as controlling pilots, but in close collaboration with technical staff at the university department. This particular interaction opens up for questions such as, what is the right place to make a drone footage for the specific design task? Answering this takes us into the realm of the politics of the sweet spot. By this, I mean the point where the drone footage is just right. That needs to be negotiated with the embodied and design knowledge of the student, as well as the technical and algorithmic knowledge of the assisting drone pilot. This situational elasticity and mediation of embodied and technical knowledge, entailing an epistemological negotiation as elevated drone visuals and underground sensations clash or meet. The challenge of finding the sweet spot of aerial vision enables us to think about technologies and embodied knowledge and how they emerge. So on the image here you can see Peter. He's our technical assistant in helping the students out with the drone, also because because they're flying. Some of my footage will seem very rural, but they're actually flying close to urban centers, and the legislation in Denmark prohibits that unless you are a certified drone pilot, which is the case of Peter. But again, a little bit like the drone enabled me to think about volumes, the presence of Peter together with the students enables me to think about the interaction of knowledge frames and the clashing of that, and how what he knows and what they know has to come together in a complicated kind of sense to find the exact spot. And one of the things that I noticed, also speaking to the students, because I didn't run the studio, there was two of my colleagues that I'll quote in a minute. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that on-site negotiation. But no, it's not quite there, and Peter's kind of like, well, any height is possible unto a certain limit, right? But what is the right place? And that is impossible to answer if you're a drone pilot only. But it's very possible if you're an urban design student with knowledge about landscape and you have a design task. So that nexus of knowledge and epistemologies is actually, I think, quite interesting. Just for reference, I'll give you a few visuals so you can see what the students are doing. This is a village community outside of Aalborg, close to a forest. And so they do collaged drone mappings of the site, and they sort of impose the different types of data and different types of things they can know, utilizing the drone and utilizing the different types of sensor technologies that you can apply. Also, and this is probably more standard sort of architectural renderings where you see sections on planar projections, but also the aerial gaze and view. And I think the latter, the bottom image here actually shows quite well that depending on the design task, the right spot for making the footage is actually crucial, and that's where the negotiation takes place. As I can't take all the credit for this. I've discussed this with my colleagues very much, of course, but Lea Louise Laursen and Signe Hall, the two people who are running the studio, they actually published a paper in the Journal of Landscape Architecture where they sum up some of these insights that I would like to bring forward here. So they argue, quote, "In this paper we've explored how drones can advance creative mapping through a combination of drone imagery and collage-like mapping techniques, as well as drone in on-site fieldwork. Throughout our explorations, we reveal how the drone can provide a volumetric perspective, both in the on-site explorations and in the map-making process. We see that by introducing the drone, we can reveal the tangible and material reality of the landscape. In this respect, our creative mapping uses drone imaginary to underlines the performative nature of maps, as they can be seen as agents in the formation of landscape knowledge. These maps provide new spatial knowledge that takes into consideration that the landscape is three-dimensional, as well as it's revealing new relationships between different fragments and layers of the landscape. Throughout our exploration, we found that the merging of aerial imagery and creative mapping has great potential to be further explored as a method of correcting the two-dimensional mapping representations. This correction can be further enhanced by utilizing the drone's ability to collect other types of data, such as heat and particle sensors. This, combined with the drone's volumetric perspective and collage mapping technique, would reveal an even more and deeper landscape knowledge, including ecological and multi-species aspects. So I wanted just to show you this example because there's a couple of things going on. There's the immediate sort of interaction between the drone pilot and the urban design student and the interference of knowledge frames, as it were, finding out what is the adequate and right position for doing your, not just the footage, but also your registrations and your mappings. But I think also at the end of this quote, Leah and Senior are arguing for a wider understanding of the application of this technology. And so I wanted to bring you to the second vignette, which is probably not very standard in academia, because I'm going to show you stuff from applications that were failed. But I mean, that is standard in academia, just not standard to show them. So this is elements from some of the applications we made for both the European Union Marie Curie doctoral program, but also a couple of other applications, and we're sort of still working on them. So we're not gonna give up that easily. You should never. So all of the examples here that I'm sort of trying to collide into one with this volumetric landscape mapping theme also engage with more than visual sensations. So the case is engaged with how volumes and three-dimensionality potentially is afforded by drone technologies if we move beyond the camera. And in the applications, we question how volumetric perception frees us from two-dimensional visual projections, but also the policy of flat maps. In thinking through how volume might liberate us from flat projections and epistemologies, we also get a better grip on ecologies and human and more than human life forms existing in the spaces and the sites of our attention. Exploring volumetric ecologies with drones changes the way we engage territories as researchers, but potentially also in politics. In this section, more than visual remote sensing technologies like thermal sensors and air quality detection systems are some of the background issues that I'm thinking of. I couldn't possibly take you through all the, and actually some of the footage here is not from Danish geographies. I'm sure some of the Americans will recognize them from my trips into national parks in the US, but it doesn't really change anything because the point is that it's a landscape mapping where we try to explore and expand the perspectives to also include the wider and more than human perspectives. The particular Marie Curie application was titled The Crisis of Representation and the Representation of Crisis, or CREP for short. And I can't take you through all of it, but the work package 1 on urban design and landscape mapping imaginaries is interesting, I think, in this context. And what we argue there is that, pragmatically seen, what is interesting is that the habitats of humans are a hybrid of infrastructural landscapes and biological ecologies, whose intertwinement are the key matter of interest. Understanding the multidimensional complexity of contemporary urban landscapes, with both climate challenges but also home to billions of people, is of course needed. The representation of myriads of agencies that make up these urban landscapes is complicated and requires both well-known methods and approaches, such as geosensitive location data, aerial maps, statistical representations of population, as well as deep and sensitive ethnographic accounts for the atmospheres and ambiences in these habitats. However, representing urban landscapes might also involve new methods and technologies such as drones, thermal cameras, and different location-sensitive sensor technologies. Making territorial representation is not possible without simplification and reduction, which I think no representation is. But we wanted to aim for a more holistic and multidimensional way of knowing place with this project. The already interdisciplinary gaze of urban design is a reasonable good foundation for this exploration. But also asking complex questions like who counts as agents within these landscapes, and how do we ensure the voices of the marginalized, underrepresented, and inarticulate are heard in one of as in the dimension or in the focus point of the project. So we're asking how we can ensure that plans and policies and designs for future interventions will represent all those parties and elements that needs to be represented. Hence the crisis of representation and the representation of crisis. And that these pluriverse representations are not merely traces, but contrary facilitate pluriverse conversations and explore how the human and more than human voices are given agency. So the aim of the project, CREP, is to critically deconstruct the way in which more than human places are represented and to create knowledge about how we represent the urban, rural, territory and its agents in a more holistic type of way. This is a short sort of summary diagram of how we think about it. So the landscape mapping, where you have the drones and the technologies on the bottom left, and then interaction with communities, with people through living labs and co-creation processes, but also interfacing with artistic practices and art interventions as a way of unlocking some of this. So it's a sort of, there are many more modalities going on than just the drone stuff, basically. But what I wanted to flag here was this idea, also connecting to a couple of the talks yesterday, that utilizing some of these drone sensing technologies to open up a conversation of giving voice to, say, nature, to waters, water basins, to rivers, to birds, to all kinds of non-human life forms also seems to be quite important. And we wanted to sort of frame that in these projects as well. Yeah. Okay, time is running, so I'm gonna just very quickly dip my toes into vignette number 3, also because it's pretty well-trodden territory, I suppose, for most of us. Talking about a layer of the surveillance taxonomy. So drones add an agile and mobile and volumetric dimension to the classic phenomenology of surveillance that moves from co-present human-to-human surveillance over the power of elevation towards digital and remote sensing surveillance technologies. So more than visual and volumetric drone sensing adds another layer to the surveillance taxonomy. The drone combines the elevated and remote sensing power into an agile extension of the situational surveillance, stretching out into new mobile configurations of the proximity connectivity nexus, as well as extending beyond the visual to utilize other types of sensor technologies for the cameras. And we're all aware of the many different ways in which surveillance ecologies are hardwired into our landscapes. And one of the things that I wanted to just address was this very simple sort of taxonomy, or where you think about surveillance as sort of the classic person-to-person, same eye level sort of shadowing type of thing. Then you have the elevated viewpoint, which gives you the intelligence advantages of looking above, CCTV, mobile phones, and other types of equipments, and then drones. And as you can see from the sort of the sketch diagrams, is also that I'm thinking about humans in the loop. So at times you have an operator. Obviously the first two situations is human to human, right? But in the CCTV you might have a human operator watching the screens, or you might have an automated system where things start to become autonomous in their own kinds of ways. Our mobile phones gives away tons of data that is enabling surveillance technologies, and drones I think are interesting because they have this volumetric agility. I was thinking about this in relationship to an airport where we did some research on airports, and very small drones are able to hover around the spaces. There is not much wind, and they're super agile. You will have no blind angles if you have these sorts of technologies on your hand. But this taxonomy has been I've been sort of trying to lay that out in a paper in Surveillance and Society back from 2016. So if you're interested, you can sort of dive deeper there. All right. So let me just start the in-flights toward the ending here. I think the framing of machinic multi-modal sensing and this idea of looking at the situation, how it's stretched, and how humans and technologies interact is very important, and not particularly new either. But I think it's actually something. There's a couple of things going on in terms of the development of technologies that is actually changing things a little bit, I think, and I will of course speak a little bit to that. I think the first point I wanted to make is that the more than visual drone sensing provides a multi-dimensional and complex representation of sites and ecologies in ways that probably will become only more sophisticated in the light of AI explorations. Now this, of course, means new forms of site-specific, ecologic, and holistic forms of knowing. It allows for wider and deeper understanding of particular locations and geographies. However, the dynamic and powerful abilities stemming from this might also lead to new levels of black boxing of technology. the lack of transparency into the inner workings of algorithmic and software-based spatial mapping could lead to new forms of knowledge exclusion and lack of democratic accountability. I am, however, deliberately saying could lead, since the accountability and democratization of these technologies may lead to more open and inclusive processes. What will happen is probably a new shielding off due to economic and geopolitical securitization logics preventing general publics from insights into these technologies. And I think it makes me think about a new epistemic era politics that we might want to sort of confront and have a conversation about. Secondly, the more than visual drone sensing leads to better three-dimensional and volumetric understanding of sites and places, which I kind of argued extensively in this talk. As much as the combination of aerial viewing points and visual sensing has led to a powerful regime of knowing, it is also not the full picture. So understanding more about the layered complexity of ecologies and circuits of matter is vital for making better decisions within planning and policy. It is, however, also vital in the scientific optic. Knowing more accurately about the world's complexity is still an important dimension of the ongoing scientific quest for environmental knowledge. So the more than visual drone sensing technologies have potential via their volumetric understanding to override some of the misunderstandings and simplifications grown out of the flat projections and planar representations. And finally, I think the ways in which more than visual drone sensation enrolled into sophisticated socio-technical assemblages points to a new dynamic of human-machine interaction. Operating drones is one thing that requires formal training and knowledge about technologies. However, it also requires an interface with other types of knowing. In the case of urban design that I just discussed, this could be this field-specific knowledge that allows one to judge if an aerial representation is right or adequate for the design task at hand. The same type of example could apply to any other field of discipline, biology, geology, planning, so forth. The point is that there is knowledge nested within the technical system and software driving the drones, as it were. But there is also knowledge within the relative domain expert that the drone is applied to, or expert field that the drone is applied to. So that this knowledge sits mostly in the body and brain of the domain expert. And obviously, it is also distributed to, for example, internet-based services or databases. The meeting point of the knowledge from the drone pilot, the domain expert, and the various external knowledge forces is dynamic and situational. So at this moment, the advent of a new player makes the embodied and situated knowledge nexus even more interesting. When AI is applied, new forms of interaction and dynamics are at stake. We might foresee an automated, cybernetically closed learning loop where there's no human in the loop. Automated AI-based, more than visual drone sensing may indeed put the game to another level. So, I want to return to the new epistemic era politics. I would love to end on a hopeful and optimistic note, but I think geopolitics and economic interests might point in other directions. Regardlessly, I think we need a critical engagement with the new epistemic era politics. Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic and really insightful presentation. I am going to collect questions now. I have one myself. I can start with that if there's no hand. No, but Lisa, please go first.
Thank you for the presentation. Really fascinating, and appreciate the discussion of the framing and the vignettes. And I also appreciate your focus on the kind of elasticity of situations and the volumetric, what you call that volumetric agility of the drone. I'm just wondering if, like, I think your framing assumes that the drone is used to observe, monitor, and know. And what we're seeing in Ukraine, and you invoked that at the outset, so I thought I'd return to it, is that the drone is also, becoming a ballistic. And so how do we create a spectrum of possibilities around this technology in relation to kind of contemporary aeropolitics that recognizes its potential on the one hand to help us understand situations and multi-species and pluriversal situations. And then at the same time, it can be used to obliterate those potentials quite rapidly. And I say this having looked at drone videos that are basically the equivalent of snuff films, where soldiers are begging in the battlefield to the operator on the other end of the drone to not have the drone run into them and explode their bodies. So, yeah, you kind of alluded at the end to some of the more problematic situations with the technology now. So just, I'd love to hear your thoughts, given how much you've been thinking about drone technology and its relation to epistemology and
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that comment, and I totally agree that I think the way to assess and I think the cases or the empirical sort of vignettes that I touch upon are all also related to something that I know from my own research and from my own engagement. And I haven't been doing research on the militarization or the military application of drones, but of course this is super important. And probably also the most mediatized and most discussed dimension of drone practices at the moment, right? Because we are hearing every day about the not just the importance of drones on the battlefield, but also the way in which drone manufacturing and drone thinking about that whole sort of drone or infrastructural landscape is actually providing, counter practices and measurements against the Russians, as well as the Russians are applying the crude, larger technologies and so forth. So I totally agree that is, and I think that's where we're left with the new epistemic era politics, is that there is, as always, a question about whether it can, it can be for the, I don't know, this sounds terribly simplistic, but for the better or for the worse, right? And I think there are potentials in these technologies to help us understand spaces and people and agents with no voice in a better way. So that's in a sort of sense a hopeful and progressive kind of thing. But equally, or even more predominantly, is the devastating and applications of drone technologies in killings across the world. And so I'm not suggesting that latter part should be ignored or anything. Absolutely not. I think if we look at the bigger picture, I think there's a lot of research going into that as well. And I thought I would. If I was, I'm not going to do that, but if I was to write a book about drones, I would try to balance those elements, right? I think in the research and in the project suggested, and also in the interaction with the students, we're trying to see how can we utilize this technology for peaceful purposes in these landscapes and urban settings, right? But I totally agree with you that the way in which the destructiveness of drone technology should be just as important, if not more. Yeah. Thank you.
Emmanuel.
My turn? Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ole, and especially for insisting on this volumetric dimension that is so crucial, and maybe we hadn't discussed sufficiently these days. I was very interested in your notion of elasticity and this stretch situation. And it's actually something that kept me busy for quite some time, because of course we are all dealing with very recent contemporary phenomena, and we don't have the necessary historical distance to really understand to what extent these are totally new. They always sound as being a total rupture with regard to preceding eras, and yet at the same time we want to understand what makes them so characteristic or maybe even categorically different. Of course, if you start from the situation you described, communication as having to go to the marketplace, so if I have to converse with someone, we have to meet at the marketplace and then we converse, it sounds as if we're witnessing a total change. But so my question would be, is your concept of elasticity accounting for a matter of degree, a change, an increase of intensity, or is it really a categorical leap? And maybe let me elaborate. The concept of a stretched situation was one I'm familiar with from communication theory, quite old in the 1980s already, or early 90s. Konrad Ehlich, for example, a German communication theorist. And he has this idea that we have a stretched communication situation whenever we communicate with a thing called writing. So when I communicate with my whatever administration, I send them a letter, it takes ages to come back, but that's how it is. And still I'm communicating, and we have a situation of communication, yet there is no proximity. So of course, deconstructive reading all of this would say, and Derrida would say, the situation was a stretched situation from the beginning. It was a situation of separation from the outset. And then maybe there's an increase in this, but maybe the marketplace in the beginning was already a stretched situation, because of course there's belatedness, there is, it takes time. And so I'm just wondering if we're really witnessing such a harsh new situation, or if it's not just a matter of increase to the extent, of course, that it's making a huge difference, and yet I don't see why it would be something totally different. So every presence always already was telepresence. Every technology was remote technology. There is no technology that is not a remote technology. So we use many concepts, but if we think about them more specifically, it seems to me that we should end up with exactly the kind of metaphor you used, elasticity, because it's about stretching more and less. So I liked your suggestion. I don't know if my reading is correct.
Thank you so much for that. I don't consider it to be absolutely novel, and I do consider it to be sort of a continuum, or so an overlayering. So it's not like the co-present interaction has changed or been dissolved. And actually, if you want to go back in references, I'm a sociologist, so Irving Goffman's PhD dissertation from the Shetland Islands in the 1950s, he recognizes what's called the knot line. And the knot line is like, imagine two people walking across in an open landscape, and you kind of see, that's probably a person. Hey, that's Jim. Uh-oh, I owe Jim money, right? And then suddenly, and at some point, if you are not interacting, you're actually making some sort of breach of a social convention, right? Which is the knot line, right? So you will say hello or whatever, right? Which just suggests, and other types of interactional analysis, like what I did in my work on groups moving around in the city. Like take a children's family, right? Trying to keep the children within reach, and sometimes calling them, communicating them, all these sorts of things. So I don't think there's anything radically new, or it's sort of overridden completely by it. It's a continuum, but I think that we have. I do think I'm using that extensively, this meta or this reference, but this "Hi, I'm on the bus." This constantly giving account of being where you are in a real-time situation that is stretched, which wasn't possible before the internet and those kinds of communications, right? You would actually have to wait, right? Wait it out, and so I don't imagine this to be radically different. It's more like a continuum, and I think if you want to stay with the metaphor, until it breaks, there's a continuum in the elastics, right? Yeah.
Okay, we have 4 more questions, so I ask you to be brief and concise.
I'm going to ask a slightly different question that I actually initially wanted to ask. First of all, I love this because I love Don Ida, and I think we're very much on a similar page with this. But with this question of elasticity, I think there may be a different way of thinking about elasticity that might be actually really interesting, and I sort of want to make a proposal which I think is in your text, but maybe could be brought out more, because I think it would be helpful to sort of decorrelate the drone from the sensors and say that at one level, the drone extends things within like everyday reality, right? Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, it's not actually the epistemic engine. The epistemic engine is the sensors, right? And what the sensors do is access other like weirder kinds of reality, right? That are not available to us as humans as everyday reality. And this is challenging our cognitive plasticity. And in some ways it can be really rewarding because we can discover the environment and animals and things like this. But on the other hand, and I think this is where you come at the end, and this is sort of feeding on another question that I asked Lucretia was this, not Lucretia, where is she? Yeah, it was Lucretia, but you're not Lucretia. But in any case, the question of artificial intelligence, right? Because when you have artificial intelligence that is processing that other reality data, that weird reality data, which has many layers depending on the sensor, right? Then you get in a situation where you as the human are supposed to be in the loop and navigating, and you have a whole lot of stuff that you know you don't know. Right? And it is a question of cognitive plasticity, right? Or elasticity, right? And so I think this is a really serious question where the aerial is obviously much more alien to us as humans because we don't habitually live in that. So it's already a domain that stretches us, but it's still in the everyday reality. So the question is, is that a helpful suggestion? Because I think it's already in your work, but in any case.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think, I mean, I do think it is helpful. And also, I just wanted to pick on your distinction between what is actually the epistemology engine, because to a certain extent, I agree that it is the sensor, but the sensor is meaningless if it sits on my desk, right? So it's the presence of the sensor in a particular site, which is enabled by the drone, right? So it's actually the assemblage of the drone and the sensor that enables and becomes the epistemology engine, right?
I wanted to say about that, though, and I think I like somehow to look at how we're somehow tricked by language a lot of the time. So when I was a kid, we used to have radio-controlled airplanes, and radio-controlled airplanes were drones before you had drones, right? And so in terms of the stretching, it seems to me that if I had my radio-controlled airplane, and my dad is on the other side of the field, I could, fly him some keys or something like that, and I'd be doing the same thing we do with a drone, minus sensors, and it would be virtually the same thing. And I do think that you could have a drone that was like a radio-controlled airplane. It would still nominally be a drone. Meanwhile, I think that you could have sensors in other forms of robotic, teleoperated things that were not drones. For instance, a killer robot on the battlefield, and a lot of these same questions would be raised. So it's a question. This is a question of air versus land medium, but I do think that you can probably separate the two at some level.
Okay.
Thank you. We have another question from Francisco.
Thank you very much, Ole. Wonderful talk. I wanted to react to your third vignette on the surveillance dimension of drones. And actually, I was wondering, of course, there can be surveillance, and I think we see it in some specific cases, especially maybe the military operations as well with the drones, because these engines just fly much longer and in a more kind of maybe planned and systematic way. So that's really the kind of the David Lyon definition of surveillance as a focused, routine, systematic logic of attention. But in most cases of drone usage, especially in the civilian sphere, like including policing, what I observed is that it's actually all kinds of very different politics of visibility that are conveyed by the drone gaze, which are much more sporadic, very often punctual rather than systematic. So I was just kind of wondering if we talk about this visual prowess of the drone and its capacity to make things visible, if the concept of surveillance is the right one, or what other maybe also concepts could complement it, to really think also of the problems implied by this, because one of the I think problems with drones is it's so difficult to debate, it's so difficult to resist, because it's so difficult to know when it happens, this kind of visual gaze, where it comes from. So this very almost liquid form of visibility it implies. So I was wondering how we actually conceptualize this visual prowess of the drone, maybe also beyond the concept of surveillance, understood in a David Lyon kind of way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Francisco. I think those are really interesting observations, and I'm not quite sure if I can sort of give you a total adequate answer to it. But I think that the point I take from your comment is very much also to be alert to the messiness and the inaccuracies and the noise, right, in the communication, which to some extent might be overglassed by this sort of transparent, perfect idea of surveillance, right? So it's actually often bad data, bad connections, bad stuff. It's sometimes coincidental, who's there, who's not there, who picks up, all these sorts of messiness. So that's a good point. Thanks.
Okay. I am going to jump in myself, if I can,
Sure.
at this point. Just one comment and then one question. So the first one was like, I really appreciated the way you talked about like the elastic situation and also kind of how this dialogue unfolded. And it just reminded me also of kind of the temporal aspects of it, which kind of I think is also in this presentation. And also you probably know like the theory of the drone by Shamayu, and I think there's an extended footnote that is like 3 pages long. It's sometimes it's such a pity, like kind of some books like put their important stuff in the footnotes, which is about the difference between coexistence, co-presence, and simultaneity. And I think that's kind of that resonated a lot with kind of how you talked about stretched situation. I have a question, which is more practical, actually, and it's about the practice of mapping and kind of also how you work with your students in these kind of creative mapping practices. Because, I'm extremely sympathetic and interested in kind of ways of making volumetric space readable, and kind of by making it readable, showing it's volumetric, and kind of go away from sort of thinking a map is always this sort of, kind of only the layer of the land. Now, my question is, because there's also kind of the act and the method of reduction has also a purpose, which is to make certain things readable and kind of understandable. And so kind of, I just have a question about sort of the practical problems, also maybe solutions, when you kind of collage and make so many layers readable at the same time, kind of how is it possible, kind of just as someone who looks at it, to kind of distinguish what kind of methods do you have to kind of, make it approachable for someone who did not make the map themselves?
Well, thank you. That's a great question and a great observation. And I'm not an architect. I'm a sociologist. So it took me a while to get into the way in which architects unfold volumetrics. My first experiences was because I was in the planning department. So I thought, the world is like, you can put it on a map, right? So I never thought anything about, that would, of course I knew the world is not the map, but I wasn't really thinking about it in a sort of strong epistemological, critical kind of sense. But as you start thinking about how you make, for instance, there are representations around here, and there are sections, and there are map, and they're planar, and this the mental trick of being able to look at the plane, the planar perspective, and the section, and sort of like a gestalt, switch between them, and get a sense of volume. That's a mental operation that took me quite a bit to sort of get around. And of course, when you show these complex layered collages, to be honest, sometimes I think they're more artful than their actual practical communication devices, right? So they have to be, at some point we have discussions about simplicity, right? And what is the story you want to tell? Also, I'm trying to argue for, and I couldn't convey that here, but I'd like very much to see animations, 3D animations, as a much more interesting way of doing it. But of course, then you need the digital media to do that, right? So it's kind of like, and I suppose the multimodality would be the ideal scenario where you had the different types of, but the conversation with the students about what to leave out and how to not overdo complexity, because the more data and the more information you lay upon it, the harder it is to pick out the story, and particularly if you're not a familiar reader. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Can I? Okay. Thank you, because it was super rich, and I had I think 10 questions all bumping around in my head, from the notion of now I don't even have the word anymore, epistemological engine, because I think it could be theoretically interesting to develop it a little bit more, and I am very interested because maybe it can be a useful concept maybe to couple with dispositive theories and more philosophical, media archaeological, media theoretical work. But my question is not about that, because maybe it's a bit complex and it's late. But I was curious about when you mentioned that probably mapping and volumetric technologies will create a shield between like general population that doesn't know how to handle these technologies and how to use them. And I was wondering, since you are also like actively designing these projects, do you incorporate and how do you envision active strategies to maybe not have this type of shield? Like, is it possible to have participatory design maybe in this type of projects, or maybe to, I don't know, yeah, maybe participatory design is a tool, but how do you integrate that? Or how can you imagine a way to integrate these things? Because maybe remote sensing, not drones, but remote sensing is one of the strategies.
No, I totally agree, and it's. I mean, I was also. I mean, I couldn't cover citizen science and participatory design, but there are many ways in which you can think about how publics interact. The shielding off and the sort of black boxing I was thinking about was more like the big corporate interests when you roll out, you know, usable models for utilizing technology, which is not really transparent to. And of course, we have students that are, you know. I'm in a computer or media tech department, so we have coders next door, and we can, you know, they can help us understand some of what goes on in the black box. But if we're going out and meeting, say, village populations and people living in different places, our job is, of course, to try to keep it operational in some sort of sense, right? Very often we do. I mean, this is not rocket science, but we package data, we make sure that the data is available, we make sure that if they are utilizing a drone, they will be in contact with Peter, not just for legal reasons, but also because, you know, how do you operate the damn thing, right? So I think there's a lot of didactics to go through, emotions to go through when you start thinking about how to work with publics and co-design. But I think if you have sometimes we're doing like if you have a very skilled student in doing 3D rendering and animation, you can have them making different scenarios, and people in the public can say, nah, it's not like that, it's more like that, right? And if you really sort of have your resources, you can actually change that during the session. Otherwise, you would pre-design the scenarios, and they were more like, say, nah, it's not so much, it's more like that, and then maybe you have a qualitative conversation about it's the middle one, but we don't have that or whatever, right? So there's many layers to thinking didactically about how to engage with. But the shielding off, I was more thinking about, you know, what happens when AI really starts become you know, a player here, and there's vast commercial and geopolitical interests at stake.
We have one last question here, and then we're jumping into the coffee break.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you because you spoke about the proximity and connectivity paradigm. I would call it like this, or relation or politics, as you said, which is something that yesterday I thought was missing from the discussion around verticality as a myth, the myth of verticality. But in my opinion, even if we think about religion or theology and their myth, there is the verticality of God, but there is also the omnipresence and I would say, God the Almighty. So I think that there are both references maybe in our relationship to technology. And as I understood, there is, in the idea of the epistemology engine, there is also the attention to the description of its quality as an epistemology engine. But so, what kind of knowledge would this epistemology engine produce? Is it a new one, as you were saying, maybe at some point? And is it enough to describe the qualities of the epistemology engine to understand the kind of knowledge that it produces? Thank you.
Thank you. That's that's a good and complicated question. I suppose that when you think about I mean, it reaches a little bit back to the kinds of sensors and where the epistemology engine actually comes into being, which is, I think, in the actual assemblage and the positioning of the device so that you can get the data that will inform your analysis, right? But behind all that, there are ontological assumptions about, you know, what are we looking at? What is relevant? You know, what are the kinds of data that are, and how do we read them? There's a lot of, you know, like, you know, some of the technology we've been talking about today, right? So the readability and the whole sort of, so I don't think there's anything new in arguing or utilizing this term epistemology engine. I think all through, you know, human history, we applied tools to get knowledge, right? But as you start having complex network-related types of technologies where you interface with many different types of, for instance, also sensors, you have a ton of different kinds of reading devices that connects into them. I mean, if you're bringing back, like in the story about bringing back the radioactivity material to the base, right, and those sorts of things, how do you read that? So I think it's a complex discussion about how you actually, how you analyze how a particular technology is working as an epistemology engine. But I think it's not. I don't think it's. I mean, Donaidi's work, which I can highly recommend, is very sort of. He's looking very much historically at things. So it's not like it's high tech kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you. Now we have 20 minutes break, coffee break. At noon, last talk by Francisco, which, as you know, will be the last of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.